Hi, folks. Happy Thursday. Hope everybody's doing well. We're gonna talk a little bit about Signs of the Sojourner, and do some after action and kind of wrap that up. Yeah, that was kind of really an incredible game. I liked it a lot. I was really impressed by it. I feel like, we talked about how this is a game that's designed to be played multiple times to sort of explore the story space. And I feel like we got sort of just a little taste of what that world is. That was very cool, and that there's a lot more in there to also explore. I think I want to start off by crediting Kyla Cage Tiger in the chat, who found an episode of a podcast that is an interview with the developer. I don't have that link, Kyla. I don't know if you have that handy. And could post it in the chat. I appreciate that. But it's the Eggplant podcast, I think. I was hoping to get a chance to listen to the episode and didn't, unfortunately. I still am hoping to. But Kyla kind of wrote up for me a little bit of a summary of some of the interesting things that were talked about. There's a lot of really good stuff about sort of where the game came from and some of that kind of thing. What struck me, or one of the things that struck me, was talking about the conversation mechanic, because that's something that we talked about a lot. So I'm just going to read from what Kyla wrote summarizing this interview. In original prototypes, the conversation mechanic was a lot more complex and detailed. I think she mentioned something about she being the developer, mentioned something about the characters having different actions they could take during the conversation based on which shapes they used or something like that. And they ended up simplifying it substantially for two reasons. It felt like players were having a more difficult time focusing on both a complex story and a complex mechanic, and since the narrative was more important, they didn't want to overshadow it. Simplifying the mechanic allowed them to put more focus on the story, and B, making the mechanic simpler reinforced the metaphor better, because in a complex system, it was impossible to have the characters behave, quote, realistically all the time. But in a more general and abstract system, the player could project a lot more of their own experiences and interpretations onto the mechanics. And that's really well articulated. I think Kylie, you did a great job of describing that, and it's a cool insight from the developer that I think really resonates with me. And some of the stuff that we've talked about while playing the game, I was kind of blown away at how simple and resonant the mechanic is, and that level of abstraction, I think, is just right. What's being described here is that you could be more specific. And for example, let's take the symbols, because we talked a little bit about the symbols, and we talked about how different areas have different cultures, and that those are sort of represented by having different symbols and symbol sets. And you could have that be, really concrete. You could have sort of, when we say that somebody is logical, or that an area is logical, that means that the way that they talk, the sort of like, the way that conversation feels is different than when you have a conversation with somebody who is empathetic or direct and forceful. I'm trying to remember what all of the different symbols were. Right, because each of those conversational stratagems has a different feel. Like each of those feels differently. I can absolutely, and 100% I would do this too. If I was developing this game, I would go into it on the level of, okay, so what does a direct and forceful conversation feel like? What does a logical and rational conversation feel like? What does an empathetic conversation feel like? And how do the rules of the game that you're playing change in these different areas in order to reflect those different kinds of things? And largely, the game doesn't do that, and I was a little bit surprised that the game doesn't do that. But it makes sense to me now, sort of reflecting on it, and I think that part of the problem is if you are looking at this on the level of what does each card you play mean. Each card is sort of representative of a statement, I guess, of a I mean, it's clearly something said, right? It's clearly part of a conversation, but it doesn't translate into actual words. And the game doesn't try to make it translate into actual words. Doesn't try to make it so that it is writing out what the conversation is that you're having. Instead, it's letting you sort of have this abstract conversation that has an outcome. It's either going to be a connection or a failure to connect. What leads up to that, what the actual conversation is and how you get to this point, that's the kind of thing that I think as human beings we're really good at projecting meaning and narrative into. There's sort of a closure thing happening here, right? Where it's giving us outlines of what a conversation might look like and how it comes to an ending, and we are filling in, maybe not literally, maybe not writing out dialogue, but sort of filling in, oh yeah, I've had conversations like this. I've had conversations where both of us were really trying to understand one another and we didn't, or where one person was being really obstinate and I tried to reach them and couldn't, and there was sort of nothing I could do about it, or where we were really different but we clicked. I think that's cool. I think that's that power of closure is really important and really valuable. I think that that's when that gets leveraged in not just games, in all kinds of media. I mean, this is part of why books can be so compelling, is that we picture things based on our own experience in a way that really resonates with us. I think that there's a choice here that the game is playing this card game, or presenting this card game, where the sort of feel of playing the card game echoes a conversation. There is sort of a back and forth and a give and take, but it's not trying to be so specific. It's not trying to sort of map one-to-one with individual statements, where then you would have to sort of figure out how to write dialogue for that. That's an impossible task. And even it's not, there is stuff in the game that's about what it means to be empathetic a little bit. I think that there's just not a lot of it. And something else that came out of this interview was the fact that Elias is the only NPC who uses the accommodate card, where it allows you to sort of clone the previous card. So if somebody plays a double, then it doesn't matter what symbols it has, you can play an accommodate and match with it. That is, that is Elias, but that's also because Elias is in this sort of empathetic zone in this orange circle place. But largely, that's not what the game is about. The game isn't about sort of the different ways that you can have a conversation. The game is about how sort of all conversations at this higher, more abstract level have this kind of feeling, no matter who you're talking to or where you go. When you go somewhere new, like you face this problem, this challenge. Looking at the chat, Toby says, I initially wanted the writing that is there to be more reflective of characters' card types, but I think it wouldn't have worked as well. So much of conversation is about small nuances of connection, and to play it up more obviously would make characters into caricatures, not people. Yeah, I think I totally agree. I think that, like, I also have that impulse as a player, like playing the game, sitting down to play the game. It feels like, a part of it is that I'm used to having conversations in games that are made out of dialogue, right? That are literal on that level. And this game doesn't give that to you, but it doesn't give it to you because what it's doing is something different than that, and it does that really, really well. So I think that's really cool. This is Science of the Sojourner, yeah. It is a beautiful game. It's a really cool experience that we've been playing over the last few weeks and have sort of just finished up. So there were a couple of other things that sort of came up in my mind when I was thinking about this game. But if anybody has questions about it or anything like that, put them in the chat because we can talk about that stuff too. I wanted to return to a point that I was making or trying to make last week that I still don't know if I've got like a really good way to say this, but I was thinking about that sort of confusion and clarity and understanding and predictability, like that kind of, we got caught up on this idea for a minute, or I did, and like Goat Simulator was invoked, and sort of the idea of Goat Simulator is a game about not being able to predict what's going to happen, right? The things that happen are absurd in a fun way, in sort of like a goofy fun way. I think the thing that occurred to me is that predictability, or I don't even remember if we were talking about predictability, but predictability is not the point. The point is sort of like the retrospective clarity, that it's not a problem if the player doesn't know what's going to happen, isn't sure what the effect of their actions is going to be. That can be a problem, that can be indicative of a problem, but it's not a problem in and of itself. The problem is when something happens in the game, especially something that happens in response to the player's action, and it's not clear to the player what happened or why. And I think that's the real issue around confusion. And when confusion in a game becomes like this thing that is really like a powerfully disengaging element that prevents the player from connecting with a game in the way that, as a designer, regardless of what your experience goals are, you want the player to be connected and engaged with your game. I think that you can maintain that even if you have things in the game that are not that are surprising, right? Like, surprising things in games are good. And in Signs of the Sojourner, we've got this question of, as you move through the world, you're making choices about sort of where to go and who to talk to, and it's not clear what is going to come of those decisions. But it's always clear when something does happen, it's very clear sort of why that happened. There's nothing that feels like it happened for no reason. The conversation that I have happened because I went to this place where this person was. Gull stole some of my stuff because I went to this place and I talked to this person that I clearly wasn't ready to talk to, and I failed that conversation so badly. I got this item that I need because I went to a town and I talked to a person. They had an item. Rather than and I think that, like, I don't know, I'm still sort of torn about it because to bring this back to the larger idea of the way that this game tells stories, I think that I find it frustrating not to be able to strategize, or even, you know what, maybe it is feeling like I'm being thwarted in my strategy. Like, this game has a map. Signs of the Sojourner has a map screen, and it has a logistical interface where you are thinking about travel time and you are thinking about the schedule of events and things like that. And yet the game is about the sort of surprises that happen on the road. I think maybe that's the underlying point, is that this is a game about the surprises that happen on the road, and I don't know if that map view maybe undercuts that, or undercuts it for me, because it leads me to expect a kind of a game that I want to play. I mean, I think that's part of the thing, is that I would love a caravan logistics game of not talking to people, just figuring out what the best route is for the caravan to take. And the fact that, that's not what this game is, maybe it would do better to sort of separate itself even more from that. I don't know. It's hard to say. Yeah, I'm feeling a little bit out of sorts. Like I'm having trouble sort of following these trains of thought to a conclusive place. Maybe I don't have a lot of really conclusive thoughts about this game, and that could be because it doesn't feel concluded. Like, it does feel like there's a lot more play to be had here. Okay. Kyla wants to point out in the interview, Diala, one of the game's creators, mentioned that one of her "I wish we had time for" features or fixes was better trip planning on the map. Interesting. That's super interesting. So, that's developers recognizing a weak point in the game that works. That, the game totally works. But it's interesting to hear that as if we had time to develop something further, that's one of the things we would do. It makes sense to me. And I think that that development might actually be to strip it down. I don't know if it should be developed further out, or if it should be sort of actually simplified in a way. I understand that they're trying to create some tensions around you can't go everywhere and you can't talk to everyone, and there's some push your luck, you can decide how far you want to go to within limits, but the further you go, the worse your conversations get. And I think all of that is cool. Like, I get that tension, I get those constraints. I just think that maybe the game would be better off if that happened through an interface that was more reminiscent of the kind of storytelling that the game is really doing, rather than a map. Kubert says, from my point of view, I think it would have helped communicate the experience the game wanted to give the player if the success or failure part of the conversations had been downplayed in favor of emphasizing that the game goes on no matter how conversations turn out. That is actually really interesting. We think of games largely of being a series of challenges to be overcome, right? Where you're gonna fight a monster, and if you lose and die, then you're gonna sort of start over at a checkpoint, because that's the game, is like overcome this challenge. And I think that Signs of the Sojourner is playing in a different space. It's not alone there, but this idea of, first of all, these conflicts are more like branching points for the narrative, where things can either go one way or they can go another way. And one of those ways is probably better, or is better in some respects, but like it's not a failure. It's not a loss condition. There are two different stories that we could tell. One is this way and one is the other way. I think there's that, and then related to that, I guess, just the idea of games having challenges that that don't end the game. I'm trying to think of like what's the body of work here, and thinking specifically of David Cage's Heavy Rain, because this was like a back of the box feature for Heavy Rain. Was like, here's a game that looks like Uncharted, that looks like an action adventure game, where you are going to do action adventure stuff. You're gonna like investigate a crime scene and try to talk your way into a bar, and you're gonna fight a guy in a motorcycle jacket, and if he wins and kills you, the game just keeps going. Like, you're not gonna, there's no game over, there's no start, retry the fight. But at that time, for that kind of a game, that was something that you had to explain to the audience, and it was sort of considered like a feature. This is something that is unusual, that you're not going to get in any other kind of game. I think that's less true today. I think that like there are more games like that, or that type of gameplay is more prevalent, although I'm searching right now to try to like come up with what one is that's more recent than that. Like, what are games that carry on this tradition of not having failure states, of just sort of continuing to push forward? Maybe it's still sort of a really alien concept, and it needs to be carefully introduced every time. That's interesting. That's actually a really interesting question. maybe with visual novels, maybe I'm looking in the wrong sort of arena, because there's definitely work in things like visual novels that do that. Well, and this is an awkward transition, but like another thing that occurred to me that I have been thinking about over the last week or so is a lot of my work is closer to this than, you know, the other end of the spectrum that I'm suggesting, where you are able to predict the outcomes of your choices on the narrative in a way that like lets you play really strategically. If I look at the games that I've published over the last several years, especially like especially something like From Ivan, which is or even more Cosmonet. I feel more Cosmonet was really a game jam game, and From Ivan had a little bit more authorship to it. So I feel a little more comfortable talking about that in terms of its authorship, but it's very much a game of like, you're going to make choices in the moment, and those choices are sort of deliberately abstracted from strategy, from sort of knowing what the outcome of those choices are, which doesn't mean that you can't look at a choice and say, I think that this is the good option. You absolutely can, but you can't always do that, and you can't do that with the sort of degree of certainty that you can in a lot of games where you are really chasing an objective. And it's also a game where, you know, there aren't really challenges in that. There aren't obstacles in the same way that there are, but there are sort of narrative obstacles. There are certainly narrative stakes, and there are things that you're trying to accomplish, and sort of whether you accomplish them or not are just different stories, right? The game treats that as different ways that the story can go, and there's an ending. There's a good ending in the sense that like there's an ending that is happier and more satisfying, but there's not a good ending in the sense that like there's a true ending. Well, except that there probably is. But yeah. I have been really reflective about that, and about sort of like how there's been some friction between me and my play style and that style of storytelling in Signs of the Sojourner. And I think that like some of that comes from my collaborators, and that, you know, I am working with other people on From Ivan, for example, or Claxo is a great example where I was not part of the writing of that game, or the initial design. So, you know, I came in sort of after a lot of that stuff was done. And some of that isn't necessarily my aesthetic or my aesthetic alone. Like, that is the aesthetic of the collaboration that I have with particular people. But I also think that in my mind, there's a tremendous difference between a game that's 40 minutes long and a game that's 10 hours long. And I have a higher degree of feeling like it is. I'm trying to think what the word is. Not just that it's reasonable. Like I think that there's an audience for games like this. But I guess for me, I'm much more willing to engage with a piece that wants me to replay it, and feel like that is not just like a reasonable thing to ask of me, but a way that I'm interested in spending my time. if those loops are, a certain length, which is probably half an hour, really, for me. Like, that's probably the sweet spot. And a game that's 10 hours long, like, wildly, the games that are long games that have interactive narratives are the ones that I play the same way every time. I mean, like, Mass Effect is... there's a 60-hour game or whatever that I have played several times. So it's not like I'm not willing to engage with a game more than once. But I'm not interested in engaging with that interactive story, right? Like, I'm playing that game not to see what the narrative possibilities are, but to enact, to perform the narrative that I chose the first time. And that's not what I keep saying song, Signs of the Sojourners is. And that's also not what, like, there are a lot of visual novels that play in this same space of this is a multi-hour experience where you're going to see substantially different content every time you play, because you're gonna play different choices. Okay. Here's another question for you from the interview. Oh, interesting. Thank you, Kyla. Diala mentions that in some cases they would write characters first and then design their decks, and in other cases they would think of some decks that would be fun to play against and then design the characters around them. Which of these approaches do you think you would find easier to work with? It's a great question. It's a great question. I think these are both really interesting approaches. It doesn't surprise me that they were both employed. That was part of the process. I think that's how games get made a lot of the time, right? Is that you are both sort of digging forward and backfilling as you go in order to sort of construct something that you have the narrative driving mechanics and mechanics driving narrative. That is appropriate and right. I think that for me, and the way that my mind works when I'm designing, the easier thing to do would be to think about a deck that is interesting to play against, and then design a character around that. And I think of like Gull, for example. Like, Gull had a really... Gull was the guard at Old Moray, who we encountered a couple of times. The first time, she threw us out of the city and stole something from us as she did so. And she had a deck that was entirely geared around purples and taking other colors and turning them into purples, right? Like, you had to have, I think she was like purple blue, and so if you played a blue, she would be able to play onto the blue, but she'd play a blue purple card that would turn it purple. So if you didn't have purples, then there was nothing you could do to respond to her. You could sort of like try to initiate conversations, and she would say something, and then you didn't have anything that you could respond to. And if you had the right deck, then you and Gull would just sort of purple. And to me, that's a really memorable deck. And Gull as a character, I mean, first of all, we didn't interact with her that much, and also she was not a nice person, and she continued to not be a nice person throughout the rest of the game, it seems like. But I I remember sort of what it felt like to play against that deck really well, and I feel like that frankly characterizes Gull a lot for me. Like, even as a player, I sort of build what my conception of Gull's character is out of what it was like to play against her or play with her. Because it was so adversarial, because there was like a real quality of it felt like playing against her. So I can see sort of designing a deck like that, especially one that is like, this is going to be this is a deck that has a particular kind of dynamic to it, right? Like, this is a deck that's going to feel a certain way when it's played in the game, and then building an abrasive, adversarial, sort of angry and stubborn person out of that deck. That makes a lot of sense to me. I think that you can absolutely do it the other way, but I get caught up then in sort of this idea of like, well, how do you balance that? And I think that you have to do the work to balance it, but also you don't need to get as caught up in that question as I tend to when I start with the narrative and think like, okay, so what are the gameplay characteristics that reflect this narrative? I get really caught up in this question of like, how does this compare to other things in the game? And how does it, I think that's really what it is like, is this equivalent to everything else in the game? And it doesn't need to be, is often the answer that I come to eventually out of that. Or even now I'm blanking on the name of the best friend character, Elias. So Elias, for example, is another one where I think it's important that Elias's character is written well. Like, he needs to be someone narratively that you care about, but you also, it's important for him to be to feel a certain way when you play with him. And one of the things that sort of thinking about this, and Kyla's comment about Elias being the only character who plays accommodate, which I did notice playing the game, but I didn't really give a lot of thought to. One of the things that occurs to me about that is that like you can have conversations with Elias that are less reliant on speaking the same language, because Elias has these cards, and maybe not enough of them to like successfully pull out a whole conversation, but Elias has these cards where if you manage to play a double blue or double purple or double green, double anything, then Elias sort of conceivably can continue on that conversation and keep it in the color family that you were speaking with accommodate. And so that sort of like attempt, even if it doesn't always work, but that attempt to like speak your language, whatever language it is that you're speaking, that he just keeps reaching out to you, I think is really interesting. And to me, like, that characterizes him a lot. And it's important then that his explicit characterization, that his character design and his dialogue like matches that, continues that. But just having that be the way that he plays, to me, like, that actually goes a long way to establishing who that character is and the way that I think of who that character is. Cool. Are there other questions that I missed? I'm just skimming through the chat looking for... Toby asked a question that I'm trying to parse. Speaking of the map, I'm curious about the choice to have routes be discoverable rather than, say, inheriting a map from your mom. Right. Okay. Not just in subsequent playthroughs, but at all. So even the first time, what's the impact of this on the game experience? I mean, I think it's a couple of things. I think that it, this is not wild that I was just about to say roguelite. This is not a legacy game, right? It's funny that I have started to conflate those two genres, because I think culturally we're conflating those genres quite a bit. But this is not a legacy game where the intention is that as you play it more and more, the things change in the game world. And I get that. Like, I think that makes sense. I think that's right. As a player, I kind of, do want things to be easier, and it would be easier if you just had access to the map from the beginning. But I think it's right for the game. So there's a couple of things that it's doing. It's controlling the experience and controlling the pace of the experience, and especially in the first two trips that you take. The first one is really controlled. Like you are taking the route that the caravan is taking. And the second one is similar. You have a little bit more leeway, but you don't have to stick right with the caravan. But you are sort of confined to a set of areas where you want to be, where you start out, essentially. And I think that is narratively controlling sort of like what are all of the possible stories, like where the places you can go are limited, and so there are fewer possible stories, especially at the beginning, fewer possible branches and things like that. But I think a big part of what it's doing is by placing this sort of barrier between you and essentially breaking new ground. It is harder to explore places than it is to visit them, right? It's harder to find a new place than it is to go back there. And so there's some sort of like narrative resonance to that. But there's also, if I try to explore too fast, if I try to go, I'm just going to make a beeline for, I don't remember what any of the cities in the like past Old Moray. I don't remember the names of them, but if I'm just going to head there. I'm just going to do that. The mechanic of the game is that you have to have conversations with people, and you can fail those conversations and gain experience that allows you to become more competent in that area, in that sort of culture. So I can go I mean, Old Moray is a bad example because Gull like explicitly keeps you from going in there the first time. But like that sort of that center section that was a lot of, I think it was blue green. If I just like head straight for that, then the first place that I go that is blue green, I'm gonna have a hard time. I can talk to people, and maybe I can talk to people well enough that I can gain some good experience from them, but I'm going to lose those conversations. And the way that the road system works means that that's going to prevent me from continuing, basically. That for me to push further in a direction where the culture gets stronger and stronger the more you go in any given direction, right? The further you go away from home, the less like home all of the conversation becomes. In order to keep going, you not only need to have conversations, but you need to like win those conversations in order to get information about, the roads that go to different towns. And so it means that like you're not going to get you're not going to get as far as you can on the first trip, right? Like you're going to have to make 2 or 3 trips towards a certain direction before you can really reach the extent of that. And I think that that's cool. Like, I like that. I think that makes sense. It makes it frustrating. Like, this is part of the frustrating thing, is that you never know which conversation you're going to have that's going to unlock that road. But having played the game once, it seems like they are pretty generously littered around. Like, there's one city that I learned about that I had no route to. But I think every other city I did end up with a route to. And a lot of them, more than I originally thought, I had multiple routes to. Like Anka, there was the whole thing with the railroad that was built to Anka, which I think is actually a big part of the story, but I didn't see it coming. I didn't realize that, that was going to be a thing. And I had gotten to Anka by another route, and then all of a sudden this railroad appears. It's basically a shortcut, right? Like to this city that I didn't know was going to exist. And to me, that implies a couple of things. First of all, like that was a cool moment. And the way that the game is set up, like that means that it's a little bit easier for me to travel around without getting as much fatigue, potentially. But also, there are multiple ways to get to Anka, right? Like, I could have, if I had not found the path that I found first, then maybe I would have found this other one, or maybe there was a third one that I never found. But, if I hadn't been doing that stuff and instead was doing something else, then maybe I would have found that third path. So, Qbert has a great question. What pieces of the game would you be interested in seeing other games run with? For me, I'd love to see the idea of character interactions altering player capabilities in a systemic way in some kind of traditional RPG. Oh, that's very good. That's very good. Interesting. So, I'm thinking, that's making me think of like, Skyrim or a Bethesda RPG system where, Skyrim is the same. I remember in Oblivion, like the way that those games work as RPGs is you have stats and you have a bunch of different skills, and as you level up in those skills, you sort of get generally better and you get more powers and things like that. But the way that you level up in those skills is different than how you level up your character as a whole. You can level up your whole character by completing quests and probably killing people, I don't know. And after you sort of like hit a level up, an experience level, and go to bed, you wake up the next morning, your whole character has leveled up. But the individual skills you level up by practicing them. So if you want to be a great archer, every time you fire your bow, you get a little bit more skill points in archery. Every time you cast a fireball, you get a little bit more skill points in fire magic. And so those games are kind of built around the stuff that you do in the world, the stuff that you actually do, you get good at. And if you want to be good at something, then you have to actually do it. You're not just going to get good at it overnight. So I'm imagining something similar to that, except that instead of all of these being physical combat skills, which they mostly are, and then you have like a charisma skill, you have a get good deals on things sort of a skill. Instead, they are more sort of more social, more nuanced social skills, or even like really taking from Signs of the Sojourners. It's not about leveling up skills. It's about sort of like shifting a focus, or shifting a priority, or shifting an identity. There's a thing in those games. A lot of games have like reputation systems and some manner of tribalism. In the Elder Scrolls games, there's a lot of stuff about the Khajiit, and like they are not given the same sort of social respectability that other groups are. So there's a lot of dialogue that plays out differently if you play as a Khajiit, because when you talk to people, they treat you differently. And when you talk to Khajiit, they treat you differently because you are part of their in-group. And that kind of thing I think is really interesting. And there are games that sort of capture that, but it's static typically. Or it's reputation, or it's like you are leveling up your reputation in a good way or a bad way. And there's not a sense of like that being dynamic. There's also not, likewise, I can sort of imagine, what if Skyrim, but in order to upgrade your archery, you had to get worse at fighting with a sword, because you're not, rather than embodying sort of like this legendary warrior that is becoming godlike in prowess. If you imagine being sort of like a person who can specialize in different things, but you can't just get infinitely better at everything. I think there's something interesting there that kind of suggests to me Signs of the Sojourners, where a lot of this game is about. The game doesn't really place value on orange versus green versus purple. I mean, a little bit in that you come from a place that's very orange, and so that feels sort of homey. That feels like a starting place. The nicest character, and the character that you care about the most, and the character who cares the most about you, is orange. And so like there is a little bit of value setting there. There are characters who are bad characters, who are like mean or evil, and I'm thinking again of Gull. So Gull like lends purple this sense of cruelty, but it's not universal. Like, there's lots of people who are off in Purple Land who are not, who are nice people who help you out, right? So there's not like a value judgment that the game makes in shifting from orange to purple, or being somewhere in between. As opposed to a lot of RPGs are about like making the numbers go up. And there's very much a value judgment of a lower level is worse than a higher level. And I think that like you could do something really cool in an RPG style game where you're thinking about stats and you're thinking about character, where you are thinking about trade-offs rather than sort of like leveling up. And of course also in the way that it does like social relationships, I think that'd be really interesting. You know, I would also be interested in, I mean, like, I'll say it, I would be interested in a version of this game that didn't have all of this narrative stuff, that, wasn't about sort of being on a clock of 5 months because the caravan is threatening to pull out of your hometown, and you're going to meet all of these characters who have problems that you can try to solve, and you're trying to figure out, like, what's the deal with your mom. I'd be down with a game that was like, you got to plan the route for the caravan and also manage your deck so that you will be able to, like, keep up with the trades that you're trying to make. And you're not, it doesn't make sense for the caravan to try to go everywhere. It only makes sense for the caravan to sort of go in the places where you can make deals with people. And what happens over time as, like, I don't know, as the culture in those regions changes, so that you have to either keep up with it or shift where your caravan goes. It's all about logistics and strategy. Like, I would be down for that game, where it just keeps going and I'm trying to, like, maximize my profits in a business. I'd be into it. That's obviously not what this game is, but, like, I think you could do things in that area where you are traveling, where you're traveling over distances. You know, open world games are real big right now, where you go to different towns, and often there are, like, economic simulations of you're buying and selling stuff to try to make money as you do that. I think it'd be interesting to have that be tied not just to what is your charisma, like, what is your charisma stat, and what is your reputation based on how many monsters you've killed in the area, and whether you, like, murdered somebody, but also something more nuanced like this. Like, what is your cultural connection with the people that you're talking to? How close are you to them in terms of your values or your history or your traditions or your manner of speech? Like, things that you could conceivably change. I think there's something really, potentially really cool there. Toby says, I'd also love to see games engage with language or dialect in a meaningful way as part of a skill set, maybe. Yeah. I mean, I think that there's a challenge that we see in this game of you have to be at the right level of abstractness for it to make sense. And a lot of how we think about writing dialogue, especially for RPGs, and a lot of how we think about writing stories for RPGs, which is primarily conveyed through dialogue, is kind of incompatible with that idea of you're gonna play a game of cards with somebody, and then either you're gonna be on the same page or you're not, right? Like it's harder to do with some of the communicative things that RPGs are trying to do or are used to doing, I guess. Yeah. Okay, cool. This is great. So I also well, I'm just reading what Kylo was writing. Limiting the roads in a playthrough is an important way to focus the story. Yeah, I was trying to say this. This is exactly what I was trying to say. Focuses the story. Since you discover certain information in certain areas, you have to play towards those areas in order to get the final, more juicy narrative there. Like, we never would have gotten to Wave Dancer if Sean hadn't focused on Blue Purple. Totally. Other juicy areas include a town in the green-orange area where you find out about your mom's past with the Rilkers, and the artist circle, and Rilkers and the artist circle, I guess, and a town in the blue-orange area where you find out about your biological father, who didn't even come up in our playthrough, right? Like, I forgot that I probably did have a biological father. All right, so before we close on Signs of the Sojourner, we got one more question, which is the dragon question, which is traditional. And I realize actually that, like, we haven't played that many games in this new run of play-by-play, and we've got some new folks. We have asked this question a couple of times in the past, but I don't know that I have impressed upon you that there's a long tradition associated with asking the question in the Q&A, would this game be better with a dragon in it? And there's lots of ways that we can interpret that question, lots of ways that we can approach answering it. I wanted to make sure that we hit it this time because this game in particular is such a candidate for the most traditional yes that this question like ever gets. Would Signs of the Sojourner be better with a dragon in it? Hell yes. You could fucking put a dragon in it and it would be rad. Like, this is a game, as much as I complain about, like, this is not really a game about the map in a logistical sense, this is a game about the map in the sense of, like, traveling to new places and exploring and filling out your map as you go. It's very much that's what this game is about. And that gives you a map. That gives you a blank map where, here be dragons. That gives you a sort of sense of a world where you can go beyond your horizon and find something entirely unexpected and new. In fact, we push out of our sort of like comfortable little neighborhood, and 3/4 of the way through the game, discover that there are robots that like are employed to farm the land. That was not a thing that I guessed ahead of time. I did not expect that. That just sort of showed up. I think the idea of like there's a land that is distant and frightening that is inhabited by dragons, I think is like a perfect fit for this game. There's something like really neat about that. And then exploring that, like, where do we go from there? I think there's an enormous amount of possibility. The question, Moyer Noam in the chat says, what color would a dragon speak in? Great question. I mean, I don't know. I think that in keeping with sort of dragon mythology, It might be something entirely new. Like dragon might speak in an ancient worm tongue that nobody speaks. Like you can't communicate with a dragon, or maybe you can, but like I don't know how you do it. Maybe it's a thing that you would have to train for. Which is, all of these are like themes of the game. Now, I think a literal dragon, encountering a literal dragon sort of beyond the wastes of the this sort of semi-post-apocalyptic world, maybe would detract a little bit from the very down-home, true-to-life themes of it's hard to travel, and as you grow up, you lose connection with your past. But it's I think it's delightful to think about. Cage Tiger just posed the question: is the dog the dragon? Is the dog the dragon? The dog might be a dragon. In the less literal way that we... Okay, so here's the problem with the dog. In the less literal way that we sort of encounter the dragon question sometimes is a dragon mythologically is a creature that doesn't follow the normal rules, right? Like you can't just roll up on a dragon on your horse and with your sword and kill it, because it's not just powerful, it is magical. And so we use that to think about sort of like what are the rules of the game world, and what does it mean to break them, and what could potentially break them. I think the dog is a great example of that, right? The dog absolutely breaks the rules of this game. The dog doesn't represent an obstacle or a challenge, and typically, traditionally, that's what the dragon is. The dragon is an opponent, is some sort of, if not an antagonist, then something that has to be sort of overcome. And the dog is just a good boy. And so it doesn't quite fit that role, but it very much does fit the role of an almost of a magical being, right? Of a magical companion that is able to help you in a material way by subverting the rules of the game. And every time that you have an interaction with the dog and Signs of the Sojourner, there's this lightness that you feel of just pulling cards out of your hand and feeling like it doesn't matter what you say, that the response is going to be the same. If there was a dragon in Signs of the Sojourner, then maybe it would speak in a similar way to the dog, where you would have to think differently about how you were playing cards from your hand, and maybe in a way that was more challenging than the dog. The dog is just pure acceptance, but I think that in that same way of recontextualizing like what these cards are and what it means to have a deck and play cards. Toby says hard to travel because caravans get eaten by dragon, though. I mean, isn't that the game that we just played? We just played a game where it's hard to travel, and because caravans... I mean, if that caravan got eaten by a dragon, frankly, I would not be that surprised. That's all that I'm saying. Rad. Cool. Okay, so here's what I'm going to do, because I'm going to switch over to a new game. We're going to start playing a short hike. And based on how this went last time, I think I am actually going to stop the stream. But I'm going to stop the stream for no more than 2 minutes. just to change the the information, so that we don't have people coming in who are confused because we're not playing Signs of the Sojourners anymore. Okay, so stick around. I'm going to go offline for just a moment and come back with a brand new game, a short hike, which I don't know a ton about, but it looks endearing as hell, and I am excited to start it out. All right, so I'll see you again in just a moment.